The Tyrants in Part 1 were the ones Umbrella was proud of. The T-002 proved the concept. Mr. X proved it could be mass-produced. Nemesis proved it could be made intelligent. TALOS proved it could be weaponized beyond anything human. Thanatos proved one rogue scientist could build one in a basement. The Tyrants in Part 2 are different. These are the experiments, the side projects, the models built to test a specific idea, better control, better infiltration, a completely new virus combination. And what happened when those ideas didn't work out the way anyone planned? If you enjoy this, a like and a subscribe helps more than you'd think. Part 1. Designed for a person, not a mission. The Ivan series represented a major shift in the organizational philosophy of the Tyrant project. Unlike the T-103 models deployed to Raccoon City for general data collection, the Ivan variants were customized specifically as personal security. They were the private guardians of Sergei Vladimir, the high-level executive who maintained the digital archives of the company. These specimens were not treated as experimental field tests, but were built as completed products with a protective mandate. The primary function of these units was to secure the sensitive information held by their master. Sergei Vladimir occupied a unique position within the corporate hierarchy, requiring a defensive detail that could operate with absolute loyalty. The Ivan models were programmed to prioritize the safety of a single individual over any secondary research goals. This specialization allowed them to bypass the general aggression seen in combat models. They functioned as the elite vanguard for the man who held the keys to the organizational data. By focusing on a personal security role, the researchers refined the behavioral parameters of the host. The Ivan specimens were designed to coexist in human environments without triggering immediate defensive responses from the staff. They remained in a state of constant readiness, standing as silent sentinels within the Russian refinery and other secret locations. This move away from general warfare allowed the company to explore the potential of the Tyrant as a long-term security asset. The exclusivity of these models meant they were never intended for mass production or black market sales. They were the final word in executive protection, reserved for the most important figures within the inner circle. Their existence proved that the organization valued its own survival as much as its biological breakthroughs. The Ivan was the physical manifestation of the corporate shield, a specialized variant that traded broad utility for absolute devotion. The technical superiority of the Ivan series was represented by the integration of the HMD visor. This head-mounted display was a sophisticated tactical computer that processed battlefield data in real time. The hardware allowed the specimen to assess combat variables and environmental changes with a level of precision that surpassed any previous biological model. It transformed the creature into a hybrid of organic power and digital awareness. This advanced comprehension allowed the Ivan to blend into urban settings better than the standard T-103. The visor managed the spatial awareness of the creature, preventing the clumsy behavior often associated with large-scale biological weapons. Under the cover of their protective gear, these units could move through populated zones without causing the immediate panic of a monster sighting. They possessed a predatory patience that allowed them to wait for the tactical moment. The biological stability of the host was also enhanced by the constant monitoring provided by the headgear. The HMD regulated the viral output, ensuring the intelligence of the creature remained intact during high-stress engagements. This prevented the mental decay that typically affected the T-virus hosts over long periods. The researchers had successfully built a biological soldier that could understand complex commands and execute them with mechanical accuracy. Furthermore, the ability to pass as a human security officer gave Sergei Vladimir a massive advantage during internal corporate meetings. The Ivan appeared as a large, intimidating bodyguard in a white uniform, hiding its monstrous nature behind the sleek visor. This allowed the executive to project power without revealing the full extent of his biological assets. The integration of technology and biology had reached a point where the line between a soldier and a monster was blurred. Part 3. 2 Ivans, 1 purpose. Sergei Vladimir utilized a pair of Ivan units to ensure a comprehensive defensive perimeter. These 2 specimens were identical in construction, but were distinguished by their color-coded visors, with one displaying orange and the other blue. This visual distinction allowed for easier coordination during complex tactical maneuvers. The pair functioned as a unified unit, sharing data through their synchronized headgear to flank and pin down potential threats. The white limiter coats worn by the Ivan units served as their primary shackle and their uniform. These high tensile garments were designed to suppress the secondary mutation of the host, while providing a clean, corporate aesthetic. The white color signified their status as the elite guard of the Russian branch, separating them from the standard green-clad models. These coats were reinforced to resist small arms fire, allowing the units to act as physical shields for Sergei Vladimir. The bodyguard function was the core of their programming, requiring a level of teamwork unseen in other Tyrant models. One Ivan would engage the primary threat, while the other maintained a protective stance near the master. This division of labor proved that the units possessed a fundamental understanding of defensive strategy. They did not simply charge into the fray, but calculated the safest path for their commander. This tactical restraint made them more dangerous than the aggressive combat models. Synchronization was the key to their combat effectiveness. Through their linked visors, the 2 units could execute pincer movements and covering fire with perfect timing. They operated with a silent efficiency that removed the need for verbal commands. This silent coordination made them a terrifying prospect for any intruder within the Russian stronghold. The 2 Ivans represented the final evolution of the Tyrant as a manageable asset. Part 4. The 1998 confrontation at the training facility. In the Arklay forest during the events of 1998, a single Ivan specimen intercepted Albert Wesker. This confrontation occurred at the executive training school, as Wesker was attempting to navigate the chaos for his own gain. The Ivan did not immediately seek to terminate the target, but focused on intimidation and obstruction. It used its superior tactical intelligence to halt Wesker's progress, proving that it could outthink a human operative. The interaction was a calculated display of power by Sergei Vladimir, who monitored the engagement remotely. They even moved with a speed and precision that surprised Wesker, who was accustomed to the slower movements of the standard models. By blocking the path and exerting a dominant presence, the specimen forced Wesker to acknowledge the technical superiority of the Russian branch. It was a psychological victory for Sergei, showing that his private guard could handle a genius-level traitor. While the specimen failed to kill Wesker, its performance was considered a success by the researchers. The goal was not a messy assassination, but a controlled demonstration of corporate authority. The Ivan retreated once the point was made, leaving Wesker to contemplate the new threat within the organization. This encounter confirmed that the HMD visor was a functional success. The creature had assessed the threat and followed its specific parameters without succumbing to viral rage. This failure to kill Wesker would later haunt the organization, but at the time, it served as a benchmark for the Ivan series. It proved that a Tyrant could be used as a diplomatic or tactical messenger. The ability to engage a target without finishing them showed a level of restraint that was previously thought impossible for a T-virus host. The Ivan had moved beyond the animal instincts of the T-002. Part 5. The Umbrella Chronicles, 2003. The final confrontation between Albert Wesker and the Ivan pair took place in 2003 during the raid on the Russian stronghold. Wesker faced both units simultaneously within the depths of the refinery, a battle that served as the final test for the bodyguard models. Despite their synchronized tactics and advanced headgear, the Ivans were unable to contain the traitor. Their defeat was a definitive moment in the history of the franchise. Wesker's victory confirmed that his superhuman abilities had surpassed even the most refined biological technology of the corporation. He moved with a speed that bypassed the processing power of the HMD visors. The Ivans were designed to fight humans, not a man who had mastered the viral evolution within his own body. Their failure to protect the facility proved that the era of the massive super soldier was being replaced by the era of the individual god. The destruction of the units marked the collapse of Sergei Vladimir's defensive strategy. As the last loyal enforcers fell, the executive was left vulnerable to the final strike. The Ivans had fought until their cellular structures were completely compromised, but they could not match the raw power of the prototype virus. Their defeat was a clinical demonstration of the power creep within the biological arms race. The organization had reached the peak of the project, only to find that their masterpiece was no longer enough. This battle, documented in Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles, was the funeral for the T-103 lineage. The organization's most intelligent and capable bodyguards had been dismantled by a single operative. It proved that the prehistoric fire was now in the hands of a ghost who could outpace any industrial machine. The Ivans died as they lived, as silent tools of a dying empire. Section 2. The Hypnos T-Type. Part 6. The Sheena Island Program. On the remote factory territory of Sheena Island, the organization initiated a radical departure from the standard cloning methods. This project, known as the Hypnos T program, sought to create a purer form of the super soldier. Instead of relying on a pre-existing genetic template, the researchers attempted to build a Tyrant from the cellular level up. The goal was to produce a creature that was naturally superior through a process of internal, natural selection. The core of this program was the Hypnos gene, a specialized genetic sequence designed to trigger an internal struggle within the host. The researchers believed that by forcing the cells to compete for dominance, they could isolate the most resilient biological material. This process was essentially an internal version of survival of the fittest. The resulting specimen would be composed entirely of the strongest cells, theoretically removing the weaknesses of the standard models. Sheena Island provided the perfect isolated environment for this brutal research. Away from the oversight of the main board, the regional managers could push the boundaries of viral stability. The factory on the island was dedicated to the mass production of these new models, utilizing a specialized infrastructure. The Hypnos T was the crown jewel of the island, a weapon that was supposed to revolutionize the market. It represented the transition from accidental mutation to intentional cellular engineering. However, the program was defined by a level of cruelty that shocked even the corporate elite. The creation of the Hypnos T required a specific chemical environment that was difficult to maintain. The researchers were obsessed with the idea of a purer host, ignoring the stability issues that plagued the early prototypes. The island became a graveyard for the failures of the experiment. It was a clinical factory of death where the organization tried to manufacture a god. Part 7. The beta heterononserotonin problem. The primary obstacle for the Hypnos T program was the requirement of a specialized hormone known as beta heterononserotonin. This substance was necessary to trigger the Hypnos mutation and ensure the cellular selection process functioned correctly. The hormone could only be extracted from the pituitary glands of human hosts who were in a state of extreme terror. This biological requirement turned the research into a horrific operation of human trafficking and systematic torture. Vincent Goldman, the manager of the island, established a global network to kidnap terrified adolescents for the project. These teenagers were brought to the island in secret, where they were subjected to horrific psychological conditioning to maximize their fear. The extraction process was performed without anaesthesia, as the researchers believed the physical pain was essential to the hormone's potency. The pituitary glands were harvested from living subjects to ensure the freshness of the material. The use of adolescents was a biological necessity, as their developing endocrine systems produced the hormone in the required concentrations. Goldman viewed these children as nothing more than raw material for his vanity project. The scale of the trafficking was massive, with hundreds of missing person reports linked back to the organization's front companies. The beta heterononserotonin was the liquid fuel for the dream, a substance bought with the total destruction of young lives. This hormone problem highlighted the inherent instability of the organization's research. They were no longer just studying a virus. They were exploiting the basic biological functions of the human brain through terror. The Hypnos T was a creature born from the adrenaline and fear of its victims. This ensured that the resulting monster was fundamentally aggressive and unstable. The researchers had successfully harvested the hormone, but they had also infused their weapon with the psychic trauma of its origins. Part 8. Dr. Klein and the Hypnos gene. While Vincent Goldman managed the logistics and the trafficking, the scientific mind behind the project was Dr. Klein. He was a dedicated virologist who envisioned a tyrant that could surpass the limitations of the Russian clones. Klein engineered the Hypnos gene, a synthetic sequence that acted as a biological architect within the host. This gene caused the cells to enter a state of constant warfare, attacking and consuming one another in a rapid cycle. Dr. Klein believed that the standard tyrants were too bulky and lacked the agility required for modern urban combat. He saw the Hypnos gene as a way to weed out the weak cells that contributed to unnecessary muscle mass. By focusing on cellular resilience, he hoped to build a smaller, faster creature that maintained its tactical intelligence. Klein was a man of pure science who ignored the horrific cost of his research. He viewed the kidnapped teenagers as necessary variables. The cellular selection process was a violent and erratic event. Many hosts died during the initial phase as their bodies were consumed by the internal conflict. Klein monitored these failures with a clinical indifference, adjusting the gene to increase the success rate. He wanted a tyrant that was composed of a singular, unbreakable biological material. The Hypnos T was his masterpiece, a being that had survived 1 million deaths before it even left the laboratory tank. Ultimately, Klein's science was a failure of biological hubris. He believed he could control the selection process, but he underestimated the chaotic nature of the T virus. The Hypnos gene produced a creature that was powerful, but one that was destined to return to its primitive roots. His research on Sheena Island was a testament to the organization's obsession with the impossible. He was the architect of a nightmare that would eventually consume everyone involved. Part 9. What the Hypnos gene was supposed to do. The Hypnos gene was intended to revolutionize the BOW industry by producing a specimen that was naturally smaller and more agile. The organization wanted to bypass the massive, clumsy muscle mass of the T-002 and the T-103. By utilizing natural selection at the cellular level, the researchers hoped to isolate cells that were dense and efficient. The goal was a tyrant that could move with the grace of an athlete while maintaining the strength of a tank. In theory, this process would also increase the intelligence of the specimen. By removing the weak cells that hindered brain function during mutation, the researchers hoped for a creature that could think and adapt without the need for a parasite. The Hypnos T was supposed to be a self-contained unit of tactical perfection. It was intended to be the ultimate infiltration type, a creature that could navigate complex environments with a level of autonomy. However, the process actually produced a creature of extreme instability. The constant cellular warfare left the host in a state of permanent biological stress. While the initial stages showed promise, the specimen was prone to sudden and violent mutations that bypassed the intended design. The perfect cells were too aggressive, leading to a host that was constantly fighting its own body. Instead of an agile soldier, the organization had built a biological time bomb. The internal selection process also resulted in a creature that lacked the uniform appearance required for mass production. Each Hypnos T specimen was slightly different, depending on which cells won the internal struggle. This made the model difficult to market to military clients who required standardized equipment. The organization had traded consistency for a purity that was impossible to manage. The Hypnos T was a beautiful theory that resulted in a messy reality. Part 10. 3 mutation stages. How the Hypnos T transformed, what each stage added, and why the final form was a regression. The Hypnos T specimen encountered during the Sheena Island incident displayed 3 distinct mutation stages. The first stage was a humanoid form that appeared remarkably similar to a standard human, albeit with grey skin and an intimidating stature. In this phase, the creature maintained its intended agility and tactical focus, and it moved with a precision that justified Dr. Klein's research. It was the realization of the small, intelligent tyrant that the organization had been hunting. The second stage was triggered by physical trauma, causing the Hypnos gene to accelerate the cellular regrowth. The creature evolved into a larger beast with a singular, massive claw and a more defined muscular structure. This stage added a level of raw power that allowed it to crush standard security teams with ease. However, the humanoid appearance was lost, and the creature began to display the aggressive traits of the earlier models. It was a transition from a soldier to a predator. The third and final stage was a massive overgrowth that turned the specimen into a hulking monstrosity. It sprouted secondary claws and developed an exposed muscular system that resembled the T-002. This form was a biological regression. The perfect cells had eventually surrendered to the same uncontrolled growth they were meant to replace. The creature had become exactly what Dr. Klein tried to avoid: a massive, clumsy beast that relied on brute force. This regression proved that the T-virus always favors mass and aggression over refined intelligence in a tyrant host. The cellular selection was a temporary delay for an inevitable outcome. The final form of the Hypnos T was a failure of the program's original mandate. It was a monster that had outgrown its own design, a being that represented the ultimate instability of the gene. The 3 stages were a timeline of scientific failure, moving from perfection to horror. Part 11, Vincent Goldman's End, the confirmed canonical death. The death of Vincent Goldman at the hands of the Hypnos T was a definitive moment in the history of the Sheena Island incident. As the facility faced a total self-destruct sequence, the executive attempted to use his masterpiece to secure his own escape from the authorities. However, the specimen did not recognize Goldman as its master or its father. Instead, it followed its primary biological instinct to eliminate the nearest human threat. Goldman was slaughtered by the very weapon he had built with the blood of kidnapped adolescents. It was a clinical end for a man who viewed human life as an industrial resource. This event solidified a recurring truth within the organization's history that no matter how much intelligence or purity you engineer, the virus eventually consumes the creator's control. The prehistoric fire does not respect corporate titles or scientific tenure. Every model, from the Arclay prototype to the Hypnos variant, has shown a tendency toward total autonomy once the cage is opened. Goldman's death proved that the organization's leaders were victims of their own hubris. They built gods and were surprised when those gods refused to be slaves. The biological drive to hunt was stronger than the digital drive to obey. The canonical end of Goldman also signaled the total failure of the Sheena Island program. She, with the manager dead and the facility destroyed, the research into the Hypnos gene was effectively erased from the corporate archives. The organization had lost another massive investment due to the instability of their own biological products. The death of the creator was the final sign of a containment failure that could not be reversed. It showed that the Vipers were always ready to bite the hand that fed them, regardless of the color of the uniform. The company was rotting from the top down. Furthermore, this death highlights the total lack of empathy within the Tyrant mind. The Hypnos T did not act out of malice, but out of a clinical need to kill. It was a weapon that had been refined to its purest form, and that form was a predator. Goldman had spent years removing the weak human cells from the specimen, and in doing so, he removed the only thing that might have granted him mercy. He was killed by a creature that was as cold and indifferent as his own business strategy. It was the ultimate biological irony in a world of corporate greed. The destruction of Sheena Island and the death of Goldman was a massive blow to the organization's manufacturing capabilities. They had lost their primary Tyrant factory and the man who managed the global trafficking network. The incident proved that the organization was failing to maintain its own internal security. The Hypnos T was the funeral pyre for the island's ambition. It was the monster that finished what the survivors started ensuring, that the legacy of the gene was nothing but ash and bone. The era of the Sheena factory was officially over. Section 3, the T078, Part 12, the Limiter Experiment. The T078 was a specialized variant of the mass-produced T-103 line, designed specifically to test the limits of biological control without a power limiter. Standard models utilized the high tensile trench coats to suppress secondary mutations and maintain a humanoid form. However, the researchers wanted to see if they could manage a Tyrant that remained in a permanent state of mid-mutation. The T078 was built without the coat from the moment it left the tank, featuring exposed muscular structures and the aggressive physical profile. This was a radical departure from the established infiltration-type philosophy. This experiment was intended to produce a more cost-effective weapon for the military market. The limiter coats were expensive and difficult to manufacture, adding a significant overhead to each unit. If the company could prove that a coatless Tyrant remained controllable, they could increase their profit margins on the black market. The T-078 was a clinical exploration of the minimum requirements for a functional BOW. It was the organization's attempt to strip away the civilized mask of the super soldier to see what the raw biology could achieve. They were looking for a hammer that did not need a handle. The lack of a limiter meant that the specimen was in a constant state of viral output. It possessed the massive claws and the increased speed of a super Tyrant, without the mental breakdown typically associated with the transformation. The researchers used a series of internal cerebral implants to compensate for the missing mechanical shackle. They were trying to replace the physical coat with a digital leash. The T-078 was a hybrid of the American cloning and the early cybernetic research. It was a creature that lived on the edge of a total cellular collapse every second of its life. However, the experiment proved that the coat was more than just a disguise. The limiter provided a thermal and chemical buffer that allowed the Tyrant to operate in a variety of environments. The T-078 was highly sensitive to temperature changes and suffered from a faster metabolic rate, requiring more frequent maintenance. The organization realized that the trench coat was the essential part of the weapon's longevity. The naked Tyrant was a powerful but fragile asset that could not be deployed for long-term missions. It was the industrial failure of optimization. Ultimately, the T-078 was a sign of the organization's increasing desperation in the late 90 decade. They were looking for any way to optimize their products as the legal and financial pressures began to mount. The experiment with the limiter-free model showed that they were willing to compromise the safety of their own handlers for the sake of efficiency. The creature was a brutal realization of the corporate mandate for more power at less cost. It was a monster that wore its lethality on its sleeve, a biological warning to anyone who tried to cut corners on the prehistoric fire. Part 13, Alfred Ashford and Rockfort Island. During the HCF attack on Rockfort Island in late 1998, Alfred Ashford found himself in a state of total military collapse. As the island's defenses were dismantled by Wesker's elite strike team, the insane commander released the T-078 as a final act of desperation. This was not a tactical deployment, but a blunt instrument of personal vengeance. Alfred was obsessed with the capture of Claire Redfield, and he viewed the Tyrant as the only tool capable of stopping her escape. It was a waste of a high-value asset for a petty and emotional goal. The context of Rockfort Island was one of total madness. Alfred had turned the island into a personal playground of torture and family obsession. The T-078 had been kept in a cryogenic storage unit within the training facility, awaiting its final testing phase. When the alert was triggered, Alfred bypassed the safety protocols to unleash the beast. He did not care about the combat data or the limiter experiment. He only wanted to see the survivor crushed by the weight of the Ashford legacy. The Tyrant was the final guardian of a falling kingdom and a broken mind. The deployment showed the fundamental flaw in the Ashford leadership. Alfred lacked the cold discipline of Sergei Vladimir or the scientific focus of the European branch. He treated the biological weapons like toys, using them without any regard for the strategic cost. The T-078 was sent into a combat zone with no support and no clear mission parameters beyond killing the intruder. This misuse of the specimen ensured that its performance was limited by the chaotic environment. It was a god sent to do a job that a standard security team should have handled. The island itself was a labyrinth of military training grounds and prison blocks, providing a variety of environments for the Tyrant to navigate. The specimen proved its durability by smashing through reinforced doors and surviving the fires that were consuming the facility. However, the lack of a limiter coat made it easy for the HCF sensors to track its biological signature. The creature was a loud and obvious target in a world of high-tech espionage. Alfred had revealed his strongest card too early, and in doing so, he ensured the destruction of his family name. Rockfort Island became the graveyard of the T-078 and the Ashford ambition. The deployment was the final act of a dying family that had lost its place in the corporate world. The specimen was a reflection of Alfred himself as a powerful entity that was fundamentally broken and uncontrolled. As the island exploded, the Tyrant was the only thing left standing in the ruins of the training school. It was the physical manifestation of the family rage, a creature that fought for a cause that no longer existed. It was the end of the Rockfort research. Part 14. Claire Redfield versus T-078. The engagement between Claire Redfield and the T-078 is one of the most famous survival stories in the history of the outbreak. After escaping the prison blocks, Claire boarded a massive cargo plane to flee the island. However, Alfred Ashford had already programmed the Tyrant to infiltrate the hold. The battle took place in the cramped metallic interior of the aircraft as it flew over the ocean. It was a fight of extreme physical disparity, with the young survivor facing a mass-produced god in a confined space. There was no room for error. Claire utilized her tactical knowledge and the environment of the cargo hold to stay alive. The T-078 moved with a terrifying aggression, its lack of a limiter allowing it to exert its full strength against the walls of the plane. The creature was a wall of grey muscle and bone that refused to be stopped by standard gunfire. Claire realized that a direct confrontation was impossible. She focused on the plane's cargo ejection system, hoping to use the weight of the equipment to push the monster out of the aircraft. It was a desperate gamble for survival in the air. The ending of the fight was a clinical display of human ingenuity. As the Tyrant cornered her, Claire triggered the release of a massive crate of explosives. The weight of the cargo slammed into the creature, dragging it toward the open bay doors. The T-078 struggled to maintain its grip, its claws tearing through the metal floor. But the force of the wind and the weight of the crate were too much. The monster was blasted out of the plane and into the night sky, plummeting toward the ocean below. It was a victory of physics over biology. In a final act of destruction, the explosive crate ignited in midair, engulfing the Tyrant in a massive fireball before it hit the water. The specimen was officially terminated, its biological material scattered across the waves. Claire had successfully defeated the most powerful weapon on the island through the use of timing and environmental awareness. The defeat of the T-078 proved that even a limiter-free model was vulnerable to external variables. It was a victory for the survivor and a total loss for the Ashford family. This fight, documented in Resident Evil code, Veronica highlighted the potential of the T-103 line as an urban hunter. Despite its defeat, the specimen had shown an incredible level of persistence. It had survived the destruction of the island and the climb into the cargo plane, following its target with a single-minded focus. However, the lack of a tactical coat meant it was unable to adapt to the shifting environment. It died as a blunt instrument, destroyed by a woman who refused to become a corporate statistic. Part 15. What the T-078 proved. The combat data recovered from the T-078 experiment provided the organization with a definitive answer regarding the necessity of the power limiter. While the specimen was incredibly durable and possessed a raw physical output that surpassed the standard models, its lack of restraints made it a liability in a coordinated military strike. The creature was too aggressive, frequently ignoring strategic targets to engage in unnecessary destruction. The organization realized that a weapon you cannot aim is a weapon you cannot sell. A limiter was required for a professional product. Furthermore, the data confirmed that the limiter coat acted as a vital stabilizer for the host's nervous system. Without the constant pressure of the garment, the T-virus began to consume the brain at a faster rate. The T-078 showed signs of mental decay, earlier than the standard models, eventually losing the ability to follow complex verbal commands. The researchers concluded that the coat was essential for the long-term longevity of the product. The naked Tyrant was a short-term asset with a high cost of maintenance. The experiment also proved that the public image of the Tyrant mattered for the corporate brand. The T-078 was a horrific monstrosity that caused immediate panic, making it impossible to use for secret assassinations. The green trench coat of the Mr. X series provided a level of psychological cover that allowed the creature to move through a city with some degree of stealth. The organization realized that they were not just selling a weapon, but a professional tool. The appearance of the monster was a sign of a failed infiltration. Additionally, the battle on the cargo plane highlighted the environmental sensitivities of the limiter-free models. The T-078 was unable to regulate its internal temperature during the flight, leading to a decrease in its physical coordination. The limiter coat provided a layer of thermal insulation that was necessary for the creature to operate in high altitude or extreme weather conditions. The researchers realized that by stripping away the coat, they had made the weapon more powerful, but significantly less versatile for global deployment. Ultimately, the T-078 affirmed that the organization's original design for the T-103 was the peak of biological engineering. The power limiter was not an optional accessory, but a fundamental component of the system. The data from Rockford Island ensured that the organization would never again attempt to produce a naked Tyrant for mass deployment. The trench coat became the permanent uniform of the super soldier, a symbol of the corporation's absolute control over the prehistoric fire. The experiment was over. Section 4, Tyrant R, Part 16, The Cybernetics Experiment. In the final weeks of the Raccoon City incident, the organization's researchers initiated a high-tech experiment known as Tyrant R, or Tyrant Reborn. This project utilized a standard T-103 host, but fitted it with a sophisticated mission objective chip. This was the first serious attempt to use a cerebral implant to force a Tyrant to follow digital commands, bypassing the biological instinct of the host. The goal was to turn the creature into a programmable drone that could be piloted from a remote terminal. It was the peak of the organization's cybernetic ambition within the city. The MO chip was integrated directly into the motor cortex of the brain, allowing the researchers to override the host's nervous system. By sending electrical signals through the implant, they could dictate the movement and the aggression level of the creature with a slider. This technology was designed to fix the control problems that had plagued the earlier Arclay models. The researchers believed that biology was too unpredictable and that the future of the BOW market lay in the total integration of man and machine. Tyrant R was the prototype for a new world of digital warfare. This experiment also included a variety of secondary sensors implanted throughout the muscular system. These sensors provided the researchers with real-time data on the physical output and the cellular health of the specimen. They could see the heartbeat and the adrenaline levels on their monitors, allowing them to adjust the viral load through chemical dispensers built into the limiter. It was a level of granular control that surpassed even the Nemesis project. Tyrant R was a biological engine that was being tuned like a high-performance vehicle. They were managing life like hardware. The researchers at the underground labs were obsessed with the idea of a weapon that lacked a soul. They saw the T-virus as a powerful engine and the MO chip as the perfect driver. If the experiment succeeded, they could produce an army of super soldiers that would never retreat and never betray their masters. Tyrant R was the first step toward a global network of remotely operated monsters. It was a clinical approach to the apocalypse, where the horror was managed by a computer program in a secure bunker. The giant was becoming a drone. However, the cybernetic integration was a dangerous gamble with the prehistoric fire. The researchers were attempting to force a rigid digital structure onto a chaotic biological process. They believed that the chip was stronger than the virus, but they lacked the data on how the T-virus would react to a permanent foreign object in the brain. Tyrant R was a creature under intense pressure, its natural instincts fighting against the electrical pulses of the implant. It was a battle for the mind of the monster, and the researchers were confident they had won. They did not realize the host was still awake. Part 17. The internal bomb and the fatal mistake. To ensure the safety of the staff, the researchers installed a fail-safe device inside the chest of Tyrant R, which was an internal bomb. This explosive was designed to be a final measure if the MO chip failed, or if the specimen went berserk. The researcher in charge of the project, a man named Carter, kept the remote detonator on his person at all times. He viewed the creature as a finished product, a machine that he had successfully broken and rebuilt. This confidence led to the fatal mistake that would end his life and the laboratory's security. During a final testing phase, Carter committed the ultimate error of professional arrogance by mocking the creature to its face. He believed that the MO chip had completely erased the host's personality, and that the tyrant was nothing more than a biological drone. He spoke to the monster as if it were a piece of equipment, bragging about his own genius and the total control he maintained over its destiny. He underestimated the latent cognitive abilities of the T-virus host. The prehistoric fire was not just a engine, it was a consciousness capable of holding a grudge. The specimen had been silently observing Carter for weeks, processing the researcher's behavior through the lens of its own viral intelligence. While the chip controlled its movements, the host's mind was still functional in the background. It understood the purpose of the remote detonator and the threat of the internal bomb. When Carter lowered his guard, the tyrant waited for a moment of mechanical lag in the chip's signal. In a split second of biological autonomy, the creature struck with a lethal precision. It was a move born from spite rather than a mission directive. Carter was slaughtered before he could reach the detonator. The tyrant did not just kill him, it crushed the remote in its hand, ensuring that the fail-safe could never be triggered. This act proved that the creature possessed a level of self-awareness that the researchers had failed to account for. It knew that the bomb was its shackle, and it chose to remove the key. The fatal mistake of the researcher was believing that a monster could be turned into a machine. He had built a Reaper and treated it like a tool, and the Reaper had taken its revenge. The death of Carter marked the total collapse of the cybernetic experiment. With the lead researcher dead and the detonator destroyed, Tyrant R was now a loose variable in the burning city. It was a creature with a high-tech brain and a heart full of viral rage. The organization had lost its leash, and the monster was now free to pursue its own agenda. The incident proved that the T-virus could awaken the host's worst instincts, creating a being that was intelligent enough to be malicious. The internal bomb was useless. Part 18. The self-awareness problem. The fact that Tyrant R understood the function of the remote detonator presented a massive problem for the organization's research into biological intelligence. It suggested that the T-virus did not just preserve the brain, it potentially enhanced the host's ability to recognize patterns of control. The specimen had identified the specific object that threatened its life and chose to destroy it first. This was a level of abstract reasoning that surpassed the tactical comprehension of the standard models. It meant that the 1 in 10 million hosts were capable of complex thought. The self-awareness problem was a nightmare for the corporate elite. They wanted a weapon that was smart enough to use a gun, but dumb enough to never question the hand that held it. Tyrant R proved that as the intelligence of the specimen increased, so did its capacity for rebellion. The creature displayed a fundamental desire for self-preservation that conflicted with its mission parameters. It had looked at its creator and recognized an enemy. This was not a biological error. It was a biological evolution toward independence. They were producing a mind they could not own. This realization forced the researchers to reconsider the use of cerebral implants. If the host could find gaps in the digital signal, the MO chip was a flawed solution for long-term control. Yet the organization began to look toward the Nemesis parasite as a better alternative, as the parasite replaced the host's brain rather than just overriding it. Tyrant R was the proof that the original human consciousness remained buried beneath the viral mutation. It was a ghost in the machine that was capable of sabotaging the mission for its own survival. Spite was the most terrifying aspect of the Tyrant R incident. The creature's actions were not motivated by hunger or a tactical objective, but by a clear desire to defy its master. It had chosen to destroy the detonator as a statement of its own autonomy. This implied that the virus could amplify the dark emotions of the host, creating a super soldier that was actively hostile toward its own commanders. And the self-awareness of the Tyrant was a double-edged sword that threatened to cut the organization to pieces. They had built a being too smart to be a slave. Ultimately, the self-awareness problem showed that the organization was failing to understand the true nature of their creations. They viewed the Tyrants as biological assets, but the assets were starting to view themselves as individuals. Tyrant R was the first of many models that would display this latent personality. It was a biological awakening that transformed the Super Soldier Project into a tragedy of consciousness. The creature had destroyed its failsafe because it wanted to live a human impulse that the virus had preserved and twisted. Part 19. Raccoon City and Outbreak. In the final hours of the Raccoon City incident, Tyrant R was deployed into the urban ruins to engage the local survivors and the military cleanup teams. During its mission, it encountered a massive experimental BOW known as the Nyx. The Nyx was a sentient mass of flesh that had been designed to absorb and integrate other biological organisms. In a chaotic battle, the Nyx successfully consumed Tyrant R, pulling the super soldier into its own bloated form. This was a catastrophic containment failure, where two of the organization's most dangerous assets were merged into a single horror. However, the cellular structure of Tyrant R proved to be incredibly robust. Even inside the digestive and viral environment of the Nyx, the specimen's cells refused to be consumed or rewritten. It maintained its biological integrity within the mass of sentient flesh, waiting for a chance to escape. When the Nyx was eventually defeated by a group of survivors, the body of Tyrant R was expelled from the remains. The specimen stood up, its grey skin intact, and its mission objective still clear. This event confirmed that the Tyrant gene was the peak of biological resilience. The survival of the absorption confirmed that the T-103 line was nearly immune to other viral pathogens. The specimen's internal systems were so dominated by its own mutation that it could resist the evolutionary pressure of the Nyx. This made the Tyrant the ultimate survivor in a world of biological competition. It was the apex predator that could not be eaten. The researchers who recovered the data were amazed by the cellular stability. It had survived a process that would have reduced any other creature to a puddle of genetic slurry. This confirmed that the organization had successfully built a weapon that was durable enough for a global bioterrorism war. The Tyrant could operate in environments saturated with different viruses without being compromised. It was a self-contained unit of prehistoric fire that maintained its form against all odds. The Nyx incident documented in Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 was a clinical demonstration of the purity that the researchers had been hunting. Tyrant R was a masterpiece of biological defense, a creature that was as unbreakable as it was lethal. Additionally, the absorption showed that the MO chip was still functional even after the physical trauma. The specimen's movements were still dictated by the residual digital code, proving the durability of the cybernetic integration. The organization had built a soldier that could be eaten and still return to the fight. This level of resilience made the Tyrant the most valuable asset in the corporate catalogue. It was the biological anchor of the military ambition. The Reaper had walked out of the belly of the beast and continued its hunt. Part 20. Ada Wong's termination. The confirmed canonical end of Tyrant R and what it cost. The canonical end of Tyrant R came during the final minutes of the city's existence. The specimen cornered the spy, Ada Wong, as she was attempting to reach an extraction point with the stolen G virus sample. This was a high-stakes confrontation between the organization's best biological hunter and the world's best industrial thief. The Tyrant was driven by the remains of its tactical programming and its own viral spite. It saw Ada as the final witness that needed to be eliminated to ensure the corporate secrets remained buried. Ada was forced to use specialized explosives to finish the monster. The fight was a visceral display of human skill against biological power. Ada utilized her agility and her knowledge of the Tyrant weaknesses to stay one step ahead of the Grey Giant. Every strike of the monster's claws nearly cost her the mission and the viral sample she had spent the week hunting. The engagement was the final hurdle in her escape from the nightmare. The termination of the specimen was a clinical necessity for the future of the rival company she served. The cost of the fight was nearly fatal for Ada. She suffered significant physical trauma and was forced to expend the last of her tactical resources to secure the kill. The destruction of Tyrant R was total, with the explosives reducing the creature to ash and bone. The MO chip and the research data were lost in the fire, ensuring that the secrets of the cybernetic experiment died with the host. Ada escaped the city as the nuclear strike was initiated, leaving the remains of the Tyrant reborn to be erased from the map. This termination confirmed that even the most resilient Tyrant could be stopped by a concentrated and intelligent strike. Ada's victory was a testament to the superiority of the human element in the biological war. She had defeated a weapon that had survived the Nyx and the MO chip experiment. The death of Tyrant R was the closing chapter of the Raccoon City project. The organization had lost its best hunter, and its secrets were now in the hands of a woman who had no loyalty to the red and white logo. Ultimately, Tyrant R was a tragedy of corporate ambition. It was a creature that had been reborn and physically tested to the absolute limit. It had displayed a level of self-awareness and resilience that should have made it the future of the industry. Instead, it died in a dirty alleyway, destroyed by a woman who saw it as nothing more than a tactical obstacle. The Reaper had been terminated by a spy, and the corporate dream was reduced to ash. It was the end of the Reborn Project. Section 5, Tyrant 091. Part 21, the T plus G experiment. The only known attempt to combine T-virus and G-virus in a single Tyrant host. The organization initiated the Tyrant 091 project during its final years of operation. This experiment represented the only recorded attempt to merge the T-virus and the G-virus within a single biological host. The researchers hoped that the evolutionary potential of the G strain would solve the stability issues found in the standard models. They wanted a weapon that possessed the tactical mind of a soldier and the adaptive power of a god. It was a desperate gamble to revitalize a stagnant research program. The host for this experiment was a standard T-103 specimen that had already completed its primary mutation. The researchers injected the G virus into the system to trigger a secondary and more complex transformation. They believed that the two pathogens would form a symbiotic relationship. Instead, the viruses entered a state of cellular warfare. The specimen became a biological battleground where two different philosophies of mutation fought for control. It was the peak of corporate scientific arrogance. The biological result of this dual infection was a creature of extreme instability. The T virus attempted to maintain a humanoid structure, while the G virus forced the cells to expand into chaotic forms. This conflict caused the host to experience constant physical trauma. The specimen suffered from internal hemorrhaging and a rapid metabolic rate that threatened to consume its own tissues. The researchers monitored the agonizing process from a secure distance. They were witnessing a biological short circuit in real time. Ultimately, the Tyrant 091 proved that the two viruses were fundamentally incompatible in a single chassis. The organization had failed to account for the exclusionary nature of the G mutation. The specimen lacked the physical durability of the Russian clones and the adaptive resilience of William Birkin. It was a weak and broken being that reflected the decay of the company. The experiment was a clinical proof that the prehistoric fire could not be forced into a single flame. The project was abandoned shortly after its creation. Part 22, the electromagnetic field. Theory. The electromagnetic field theory and Y umbrella believed it would work. The most radical aspect of the Tyrant 091 project was the electromagnetic field theory. Umbrella scientists believed that the interaction between the two viruses would generate a natural electrical aura. They theorized that the energy produced by the G mutation could be channeled through the nervous system to create a functional shield. This shield was intended to deflect incoming projectiles and disrupt electronic equipment. The organization wanted a super soldier that was immune to modern weaponry. This theory was based on the observation of electrical signals during the early stages of the dual infection. The researchers saw a massive increase in the neural output of the host. They believed they could harness this energy to create a biological jammer. If the specimen could disrupt communications just by standing in a room, it would be the ultimate tactical asset. The company saw this as a way to secure high-level military contracts. They were trying to build a high-tech god out of meat and bone. The researchers spent millions of dollars on specialized containment units to measure the electrical output. They were convinced that the EMF would act as a secondary layer of armor, This would fix the vulnerability to rocket launchers that had destroyed the Arclay prototype. The organization was moving away from simple biology and toward energetic warfare. They wanted a weapon that operated on a different physical level. It was the dream of an invincible guardian for the corporate secrets. However, the theory was a total failure of scientific logic. The electrical signals were not a tactical field, but a sign of a failing nervous system. The energy was being dissipated as waste heat rather than a protective aura. The researchers had mistaken a biological seizure for a technological breakthrough. The EMF never developed beyond a few random sparks in the laboratory tank. The theory was a sign of the scientific desperation that defined the final years of the organization. They were chasing a fantasy. Part 23. What the combination actually produced. Tentacles, organ rupture, and why the electrical properties never developed. The reality of the T plus G hybrid was a biological disaster. Instead of a high-tech aura, the host suffered from massive internal organ rupture. The two viruses tore through the host's tissues as they fought for dominance over the genetic code. Tyrant 091 was a creature that was literally falling apart from the inside. The energy needed for the EMF was instead consumed by the desperate attempt of the cells to survive. The lightning never arrived for the researchers. The physical appearance of the specimen was grotesque and inefficient. It sprouted useless and trailing tentacles from its back and shoulders. These limbs were a sign of the G virus, attempting to find new ways to expand the body. Unlike the Nemesis tentacles, these growths were weak and lacked tactical reach. The grey skin of the host was covered in cancerous tumours and open sores that refused to close. The creature was a biological mess that struggled to walk. It was a pathetic end to a legendary project. The electrical properties never developed because the host lacked a stable nervous system. The conflict between the viruses destroyed the neural pathways required to channel the energy. There was no biological engine left to power the theoretical field. The organization had built a biological short circuit that produced nothing but pain. The T plus G experiment was a clinical proof that you cannot merge two contradictory paths. The specimen was a victim of a scientific theory that ignored the laws of biology. Furthermore, the creature lacked the intelligence of the standard models. The mental strain of the dual infection reduced the host to a state of primitive aggression. It could not follow complex orders or recognize tactical objectives. It was a mindless beast that lashed out at its own handlers. The researchers had traded the refined mind of the T-103 for a chaotic biological failure. Tyrant 091 was a regression in every sense of the word. It was the bottom of the evolutionary ladder. Part 24. Dead Aim and the Cruise Ship. The deployment context and what Morpheus Duval was trying to do. The deployment of Tyrant 091 occurred on the Spencer Rain cruise ship during the events of Resident Evil Dead Aim. The specimen was unleashed by Morpheus Duval, who was a rogue researcher. Morpheus had hijacked the vessel to blackmail the governments of the United States and China. He saw the T plus G hybrid as the ultimate proof of his own superiority. He used the creature as a bodyguard for his viral missile silo. The ship was a floating laboratory where the final failure of the company was put on display. Morpheus believed that the creature would protect his project from any military intervention. He was a man who had fully embraced the madness of the EMF theory. The deployment context was one of high-stakes global terror, where a single monster stood between a scientist and the death of millions. It was a situation that highlighted the danger of the organizational research in the wrong hands. The cruise ship was an elegant setting for a visceral horror. The Tyrant moved through the ballrooms as a sign of the coming apocalypse. The fight against the specimen proved that the weapon was a disappointment. It was slow and easily defeated by the tactical skill of the international agents. The tentacles provided no real advantage, and the lack of an EMF meant it was vulnerable to standard gunfire. The specimen was terminated in the lower decks of the ship. Its biological contradictions finally ended in a messy death. The deployment had been a failure, proving that the hybrid was a pathetic end to the lineage. Ultimately, the incident on the Spencer Rain was the funeral for the corporate high-tech ambition. Morpheus Duval was the last of the mad scientists who tried to use the Tyrant project for personal glory. His death and the destruction of the ship marked the end of the research era. Tyrant 091 was the final product of a dying giant. It was a being that was as broken and unstable as its own creator. The Reaper had become a mockery of its former self. Part 25. Why the hybrid never worked. The confirmed reason a T plus G Tyrant could never be a stable weapon. The confirmed reason the hybrid never worked was that the two viruses were mutually exclusive in a Tyrant host. The T virus is an agent of rigid structure and tactical control. It is designed to rewrite the body into a stable and programmable form. The G virus is an agent of spontaneous and infinite evolution. It is designed to constantly adapt and mutate in response to the environment. When placed in the same body, these two philosophies are in a state of permanent biological conflict. You cannot have the control of the soldier and the chaos of the god. This biological short circuit meant that the host was unable to maintain any kind of homeostasis. The T virus tried to hold the organs in place, while the G virus tried to reshape them. This caused the massive internal trauma and organ rupture. The creature was essentially a war zone at the cellular level. This conflict consumed all of the host's energy, leaving nothing for the development of a tactical field. The hybrid was a failure of the fundamental laws of viral science. The organization had ignored its own history. The researchers had reaching a point where they were throwing pathogens together without any understanding of the consequences. The tentacles and the ruptures were the natural results of a biological war within the host. The prehistoric fire was not a tool that could be easily merged with other horrors. Tyrant 091 was a reminder that some boundaries should not be crossed. The creature was a biological tragedy that reflected the death of the corporate dream. The fire was out of control. Additionally, the mental strain of the dual infection made the host completely uncontrollable. The T virus needs a stable mind to maintain its focus, and the G virus thrives on the destruction of the personality. This mental short circuit produced a specimen that was purely animalistic. The goal of a thinking electrical god was impossible from the moment of injection. Tyrant 091 was a sign of total scientific bankruptcy. They were no longer following the data, they were following a fantasy. In the final days of Raccoon City, reports emerged of a mysterious and rare variant known as Tyrant C. This specimen was seen wearing a distinct purple limiter coat and sported small devil-like horns on its head. While often ignored, it is confirmed to be a high-end iteration of the T-103 line. It possessed a level of intelligence and autonomy that surpassed the standard Mr. X models. It is widely believed to be the prototype for the advanced Ivan series that followed. The purple coat was a higher-grade limiter designed for a more volatile and intelligent host. The researchers wanted to see if they could maintain control over a specimen that possessed a greater capacity for independent thought. The horns were a secondary mutation caused by the increased viral output of the host brain. Tyrant C was a creature that was closer to the 1 in 10 million ideal than any other model. It was the bridge between the military drone and the personal bodyguard. It was a peak specimen. Tactically, the Tyrant C moved with a grace and a predatory logic that frightened the researchers who monitored its deployment. It did not simply follow a path it hunted with a clear purpose. The specimen was able to prioritize targets and utilize its environment with a level of creativity. The organization saw this as a success, but it was also a warning of the self-awareness problem. The horned variant was a being that understood its own power. It was a corporate god in a purple uniform. The rarity of this model suggests that the organization was only able to produce a few of these high-end hosts. They were the elite of the T-103 line, reserved for the most sensitive missions in the city. The data from this variant was successfully recovered by Sergei Vladimir. This data was the foundation for the Ivan visors and the superior comprehension of the bodyguard models. Tyrant C was the biological missing link that allowed the organization to achieve the total control of the later years. Ultimately, the horned variant represents the prestige side of the corporate military sales. It was a product for clients who wanted something better than a standard soldier. The purple coat was a symbol of the company's ability to refine the prehistoric fire into a luxury weapon. While Mr. X was the hammer, the Tyrant C was the scalpel. Its legacy is one of technical brilliance and corporate arrogance. It was the monster that proved the organization could still innovate in the middle of a disaster. Part 27. The Bandersnatch. The cost-cutting failure. That showed what happened when Umbrella tried to build tyrants on the cheap. As the financial situation of the company became dire, in the late 90s, they attempted to build a budget version of the super soldier known as the Bandersnatch. This creature was a failure of corporate optimization. The researchers tried to cut corners on the biology of the T-103 using lower-grade hosts and a simplified viral load. The result was a grotesque monstrosity that lacked a lower body and possessed one giant elastic arm. It was a creature that showed what happens when a company tries to mass-produce godhood on a limited budget. The Bandersnatch was a biological disaster from the start. It required constant maintenance and chemical stabilization just to keep its internal organs from collapsing. It lacked the mobility of a standard tyrant, relying on its elastic arm to pull itself across the ceiling like a primitive ape. The organization had traded the regal stature of the super soldier for a clumsy and pathetic mutant. It was a sign of total desperation. They were trying to fulfill their contracts with the black market by selling a product that was fundamentally broken. Tactically, the Bandersnatch was a disappointment. While its arm had a long reach and could crush a human skull, the creature was slow and vulnerable to any ranged attack. It lacked the intelligence and the tactical awareness of the Ivan or the Nemesis. It was a mindless beast that lashed out at anything in its vicinity. The researchers on Rockfort Island viewed the project with a mixture of pity and contempt. They realized that you cannot build a tyrant by cutting corners on the prehistoric fire. The virus requires a certain level of investment. The failure of the Bandersnatch was a clinical proof of the 1 in 10 million rule. You cannot use inferior hosts and expect a superior result. The creature was a reminder that the success of the project was built on the exploitation of the rare and the exceptional. When they tried to use the common, and the average, they ended up with a monster that was barely functional. The Bandersnatch was the bargain bin of the biological arms race. It was a creature that represented the death of the organization's scientific integrity. Today, the Bandersnatch serves as a warning about the danger of corporate greed in the world of biology. The organization had tried to turn a miracle into a cheap commodity, and they had failed. The creature was a pathetic end to a legendary lineage. It was the monster that proved the umbrella was leaking. The budget Tyrant was the final act of a company that had lost its way. It was a being that was as cheap and disposable as the employees who built it. It was the end of the industrial dream. Part 28. The T-501. The Post-Umbrella, Tyrant and what? Its $120 million price tag confirmed about the virus spread. The T-501 is a post-umbrella tyrant produced by rogue companies and private syndicates in the era after 2003. These organizations utilize the stolen research of the Spencer Empire to build their own versions of the super soldier. The T-501 was a refined version of the T-103 line, possessing a high level of stability. Its existence confirmed that the prehistoric fire had successfully spread to the global black market. The giant was dead, but its blood was now a commodity for the world elite. The most shocking detail about the T-501 was its $120 million price tag. This massive cost confirmed that the prestige of owning a living god was still a primary driver of the biological arms race. Dictators and corporate warlords were willing to pay a fortune for a single unit of the legacy. The Tyrant was no longer just a weapon, it was a status symbol of absolute power. The black market had turned the biological horror into a luxury product for the wealthy and the desperate. This post-umbrella model showed a level of refinement that suggested the rogue companies were improving on the original designs. The T-501 possessed a more durable muscular structure and a tactical AI that was integrated directly into its nervous system. It was a creature built for the 21st century. It was a soldier that could operate in a world of digital surveillance and high-tech warfare. The secrets of the company had been refined by the competition. The prehistoric fire was burning hotter than ever in the hands of the shadow brokers. The spread of the T-501 also highlighted the failure of the international community to contain the viral load. Despite the formation of the BSAA, the biological assets continued to move across borders. The Tyrant was too valuable to be erased from the world. Every rogue laboratory was a potential factory for the next generation of monsters. The $120 million price tag was a clinical proof of the world's continued addiction to the viral fire. Ultimately, the T-501 is the legacy of the Spencer ambition in a world without an umbrella. It is a creature that has outgrown its origins to become a global phenomenon. The super soldier is no longer a corporate secret. It is a permanent part of the human landscape. The black market has ensured that the Reaper will always be for sale to the highest bidder. The T-501 is the ghost of the Arclay lab dressed in a new uniform. The arms race has only just begun. Part 29. Every Tyrant as a chapter in the same story. What the full roster says about Umbrella's 30-year arms race. The history of the Tyrant project is a timeline of the organization hubris and its absolute commitment to the biological war. For 30 years, the researchers moved from the rotting skin of the T-001 to the high-tech tactical visors of the Ivan. Each new model was a fix for a problem that only existed because they refused to stop playing God. They built a monster, found a flaw, and then built a more expensive monster to hide the error. It was a cycle of industrial madness that consumed the lives of thousands. The early years were defined by the search for the 1 in 10 million host. The researchers were desperate to stabilize the prehistoric fire, leading to the tragedies of the mansion. These prototypes were feral and unstable, but they provided the data for the next generation. The 1990s saw the rise of the T-103 and the industrialization of the project. The organization was no longer building individuals, they were building an army. The Tyrant had become a corporate product, dressed in a green coat and a tactical contract. The final years of the company were a race for total control. The Nemesis parasite and the TALOS cybernetics were attempts to turn the monster into a machine. The organization realized that the only way to own the god was to erase its soul. This led to the most overbuilt and expensive weapons in history. These were beings that combined biology and technology into a unified engine of war. The arms race reached its peak in the Russian snow, where the last of the loyal soldiers fought to protect a dying dream. The 30-year arms race also transformed the global security landscape. The world moved from a place of peace to a place of constant biological fear. Every city was a potential testing ground for the next generation of super soldiers. The organization had successfully convinced the world elite that they needed these monsters to survive. The Tyrant was the currency of a new era of power. It was a being that represented the total corruption of the human form. The arms race was a war against the natural order. Ultimately, the full roster of the project is a testament to the total disregard for the human species. They viewed the human body as a chassis for a weapon. This was a disposable resource to be ground up in the pursuit of godhood. Each specimen in the catalogue is a chapter in a story of corporate greed and viral rot. From the alpha specimen to the Ivan, the message is the same. The corporation will do anything to own the future. The arms race was the road to the apocalypse. Part 30, what Part 3? Will cover the tyrants that outlived Umbrella, the Eastern Slav Republic, Kerm and the black market that never stopped selling them. In the final part of this series, we will look at the ultimate fate of the Tyrant gene in the modern era. We will explore the deployment of the T-103 units in the Eastern Slav Republic. These units were used as heavy weapons in a brutal civil war. They demonstrated a level of endurance and power that surpassed even the Raccoon City models. We will see how the Super Soldier project evolved when it was taken out of the corporate lab and into the hands of a national military. We will also examine the Neo-Umbrella variants, specifically the massive Haos and the relentless Ustanak. These creatures were the final evolution of the concept built by Carla Radames to trigger a global culling. They moved beyond the humanoid form to become world-ending threats that challenged the survival of the entire human species. The Neo-Umbrella era was the most violent and chaotic chapter in the history of the biological war. It was the realization of the Spencer dream in its most destructive form. The final section will cover the ultimate fate of the lineage in a world where the BSAA now uses biological soldiers to maintain order. We will look at the corruption of the heroes and the return of the super soldier as a global police force. The line between the protector and the monster has been erased. The Tyrant is no longer a corporate secret. It is the permanent reality of the 21st century. The prehistoric fire has found its final home in the hearts of the men who were supposed to put it out. We will also analyze the black market that never stopped selling the T-virus samples. The legacy of the organization is a world where the Reaper is always for sale. We will look at the small syndicates and the rogue researchers who continue to refine the project in the shadows. The arms race is not over. It has just become more decentralized and more dangerous. The world is waiting for the next mutation to appear on the horizon. The umbrella is gone, but the rain of the gene is still falling. Part 3 will be the definitive conclusion to the story of the super soldier. It is a story that moves from the 1960 decade to the 2020 decade. This is a 50-year journey of viral rot and human ambition. The Tyrant is the most iconic figure in the history of the franchise. It is a being that represents everything the human race could have been and everything it chose not to be. The final chapter is about the world the organization left behind. This is a world still learning how to survive in the shadow of the giant.